Hey, so hey, this is a, request video. What I think about the parchment. Um, yeah, it took me forever to do this video. Sorry about that. And then suddenly I was like, what the hell have I not done this video for? So I gotta do the video. It was a request from, so I think somebody named Zita, and it's a video about, it's a video about, what, oh shit, my bong's out of reach. Um, like some parchment. Somebody found a parchment in the. I gotta get the weed. Got it. All right. Somebody found some parchment in the north of Italy, and it's all confusing. It's this mystery because nobody can read it and nobody can decipher it. Only it's like 250 pages, so it's pretty big. And it has all of the characteristics of a story, of like an actual, because it has like recurring grammar and letters. And some of the letters, like three of them, are recognizable with, like our language, like Latin. And so it's this big old mystery. Somebody found it. It was made like in the beginning of in like 1400. It was written, and it's accompanied with like 25 drawings or something like that. I didn't see the drawings. I didn't look at it, but they're drawings having to do with cultivating plants. So people think that it's like a plant manual, a plant medicinal manual. Um, but it's a mystery because it's just such a different language. And so my interpretation of this is that it's not a mystery. It's just a different language, People, it's weird. I don't know. I'm going to guess that people just don't realize, somewhere along the line from the scholars, or the scholars don't realize, that, um, that there's just other languages in the past that just died. The language we use is Latin. That comes out of is Latin, the Roman language, and there were a town that turned into a world empire, and they spread their language. You know what I mean? Just like how English spreads. Did you know that English is originally, it's like the Angles. It's just England, which is like the south eastern part of England, which is only like what, 300 miles in diameter, something like that, and that's English. Yet now it's the world language because everybody needs to speak a language, and so when a country grows in its influence, then its language does because people need to learn, and so that's how it works. And so even though it may sound kind of weird, Latin, a language originally from just maybe like a 20-kilometer diameter area or 40-kilometer diameter area, just turned into the world language, which is kind of like half of English anyway. So just deal with it. It's called reality. And when that happens, what you got to realize is that all the other languages, they die, as in like when a person dies and then they turn cold, and then their body like disintegrates into the ground and basically disappears. All of the atoms and the atoms and just get dispersed into the world, like maybe in my body is a piece of Julius Caesar, like his tooth somehow turned into the calcium that makes up my bone. That's just life. It's called life. And it's the same thing with languages. I don't know if people realize, but we don't have that much history from the past. The only history that we have of like the Rome in its early years is Livy, and that was even taken from, it's called legendary history. That was taken just from people's memory because uh, everything before 390 until 750 when it started, and before that was Aeneas, because in 390, I think it was 396 BC, the Gauls, the Frenchmen came over from the mountains and kicked the Romans' ass. They actually went to Rome. They went inside Rome. This was the same story like when they got inside Rome because the girl from the daughter of the Citadel master let them in because she wanted like jewelry or something. Oh no, she wanted their everything in their right hand, and so they just gave her all of their shields and crushed her with their shield or something. But anyway, got sidetracked. And they took over Rome, and they were gonna demand money, but then and the Romans offered some, but then they wanted more, but then at that point, like another Roman general came and they kicked him out. But before that happened, the Gauls destroyed their history books. It was because I guess they didn't have the same amount of respect for history, or maybe they were that pissed off. Um, Rome had pissed off like one of their neighbor cities who had an alliance with the Gauls, and that's why the Gauls attacked. But the Gauls ended up destroying their history books, and so they had to rewrite their history. For what? How many years is that? 4, 5, 6. 4, 5, 6. That's like 350 years from the beginning of of their uh, their country. So that's like, what are we, like 220 or something? So add like another 130 years, like in 21 50 or something. Imagine in 2150 we all lose our books, our history, and everybody has to rewrite history from our memory. And back then not that many people were literate anyway, and it was subjective. So that's our history, and that's everybody world's history. So the idea that when see, the Latins, like if this is Italy, the Latins were just a little bit. It was actually the smallest language. They came in and they allied with the Falisci, I think, which was their own language. For some reason, that part of Italy, it was just languages and tribes were really small, like people really independent. And I don't think they can move around real easily because it was all boggy swamp, so people would just, mind their own business. There's always independent people around, um, but around them you had the Umbrians, which was a totally different language, and then the Etruscans, which was a totally different language, completely related. And they were up in Tuscany, and I think this parchment was found in northern Italy, so that's modern day Tuscany, which is where the Etruscans were. And the Etruscans were a different race. Like when you looked at them, you could tell by looking at them, and they were right next to Rome. They were on the north side of the Tiger River, which is the river that goes through Rome. Okay, so and they were also just to the south of the Romans, and so they were all over. But the Etruscans probably Etruscan. That thing was probably that parchment from the year 1400 was probably a translation from an ancient Etruscan parchment that they had to translate from, that somebody translated from because it just got that old. And he took it from the vault and he made a translation to try to keep the Etruscan language alive because it was the tradition of the little village that they lived in, that they would keep this one sacred manuscript alive. And that manuscript that he translated was probably a translation or a scribe, an inscription, a copy from another one before that, because Etruscan language, the Romans took over all of Italy by about 50 BC. The Roman Republic took off, or maybe I think it was like 150. But they when they took over BC, they took over the Etruscans, and after you take over the Etruscans, the only thing that's left over from that language is are the place names, and the names of people, and then you would adopt a few words here and there, but you're not gonna the language itself is gonna disappear and die and disappear because if people don't have wherewithal to keep the history of their own city, then there's no way that they're going to keep the whole history of the grammar of all of and the vocabulary and everything of all the language groups that they take over. They don't even they don't even record the history of the groups they take over. Like Umbrian history or Etruscan history, we know nothing about them. We don't know where they came from or nothing, because all we did was take them over, and then maybe we had books then. We probably had lots of books then, but and maybe they're under the Vatican right now, but we don't know about them, and so we don't know anything. And so when Etruscan dies, it dies. And so that language, that book was probably written in Etruscan. And it makes sense that if you were to imagine what Etruscan language would be, it would probably look just like that. It would probably, out of the 26, Latin letters, maybe I don't maybe like 20 of them or something, 21, I can't remember, come from the original Phoenician, and then over the years the Romans made like 5 more letters just to help pronunciation and stuff. Now the Phoenicians, they made their alphabet because it was phonetic. You could look at, there was really simple letters that you could pronounce, and so it was a world language because they did all the trading in the boats. And I read a book by Ignatius Danley called Atlantis, and the Antediluvian World, and he was showing the alphabet of the Mayans, and he was showing how it was related to the Latin alphabet. But so if you think of the world as a really ancient place, the Phoenicians got their alphabet probably from something before that. Everybody read and wrote in those days, even the Scythians. In the book by Herodotus Histories, he was talking about the Scythians and all the different gods and the beliefs. And so the Scythians believed in the same gods as all the other people. Oh, and the Scythians, by the way, are the Mongols, okay? You're talking about the most basic, backward people imaginable. The people up there and riding around on horses and living in yurts, okay? Those people even had the same gods as we did, like Hercules, and they knew that the earth was round and surrounded in water. The Scythians knew that, and but the Scythians also wrote. They had a language. That's what he said. He's like, because he's like, in the Scythian language, it's like this. Now, you might be like, well, how would Genghis Khan and Mongols have a language? Well, they don't. They're not literate. They're just a bunch of herders. But in every Scythians are a lot of people, and in every they have their traders and stuff, and people who pass through, who are allowed to pass through, and who are kind of leaders, and those people would have a language for the same reason that anybody else would have a language. If you're a trader, you would have a language, and so why would the Scythians not? They have a language. It's just certain people, like the elite, would have their language. So just because all the people, the mass majority, don't, doesn't mean that the elite wouldn't. So the elite have their own language, but it would, if people are so far away from each other, it would evolve, and it could change a lot. It's not that hard to make a language. In the year 800, one guy made the Russian language, Cyrillic. He just made it because he wanted Russia to be more independent than the Mediterranean world. So he made his own language. And also around the same time, the king of Korea made the Korean language, Hanguk. He just created it by himself, and it's the language they still use today, just like Cyrillic. So that happened. If it happened then, surely it happened before that. Even before that, when people were stronger, even and more, resourceful, people were making languages left, right, and center. Somebody probably you would make people would escape from some catastrophe or whatever, a war, and they'd have to start a colony somewhere, and they'd never connect with their original place. And nobody really reads and writes, and you have a mishmash of all these different people, but you have a few really smart people who remember the language. They could make a language, but adapting to the pronunciation and language of the people they live, right? And so there, boom, you just made your own language. Even and you could even make your own letters, depending on how much technology you have. If you used to make, if your old language was like curves and stuff, because in your old technology and your old civilization you could write with like feather pens with nice oil, but now you live with no technology and the only way to write is by hacking in bark. You would change the letters and you would make them only straight, so you don't have to curve and simple. So languages evolve. So that was probably Etruscan that that they found, and it was just because Herodotus also said that the Gauls could use. Oh, no. Julius Caesar, when he took over the Helvetii, modern day Switzerland, and they raided all of the Helvetii tents and stuff. They found their writing they wrote, and it was in Greek. So the Helvetii adopted Greek language. The Swiss in BC times adopted Greek language. Okay, so they had some like scholar go down there and bring it back. So everybody had language. It was just different, and so that was probably an Etruscan language that had some similarities with, because the Etruscans were sea people too. They traveled around on the sea, and so they probably interacted with the Phoenicians and adopted like only three of their letters or whatever, or maybe more. But then the three were the ones that they could compare with modern day Latin, and it literally is that different, so that you can't recognize any of it. That's how different these languages are. Back in those days, people didn't travel as much, and the language group was different. Even like I said before, the Etruscans, it was a different race. You had different races living side by side. And even in modern day like tribes in America, I was reading Lewis and Clark, and different races who look different were overlapping each other, even in just 100 years ago in America. The Mandans, and there's a town called Mandan Indians. They were white people pretty much, and they lived in a town with like surrounded by a wall, and but just next door were Crow Indians, who were really dark skinned Indians who rode around on horses, and a lot of times the Mandans and the Crows would overlap in territory, and other Indians too would nomadic Indians that look different would overlap. So if you have races that are that different, and you'd have languages that are that different living in close proximity. Like modern day France, that would be a language. That's as big as France. Well, in ancient Italy, which is smaller than France, you had the Umbrians and the Falisci and the Latins, and then the Etruscans, and then I think is the yeah, it was like five languages. You know what I mean? So the world was a lot different. So yeah, it was just that different. So yeah, people should just assume that it's Etruscan, and because everybody knows how much evidence it is, and so when you know how much evidence it is, people can guess whatever the hell they want. The scientists could say, yeah, Etruscan, because that's where Etruscans were, but somebody else could be like, well, maybe it's from before that. But I don't think that makes sense, because how could you copy transcripts for that long? I mean, it's pretty impressive to make it to 1400 years after Etruscan died out. And I remember I got the idea to say this stuff because I was listening to the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire last week or something, and he was mentioning, he's like, yeah, and in those days, by that time, those languages had died out, and so and I think he was talking about a time period in Italy. This would have been, yeah, around the time of Caesar or something. Oh yeah, no, like at the time of like Augustus and stuff, which was like 2,000 years ago, and they took over. The other one's like 150 years before that. So in 150 years, languages would die out. Um, because Rome penetrated the entire ancient world. They would go and take over a country, and then they would build a road through it, and then they'd build little avenues up into the mountains, and so they could access everywhere. And then they would disperse people. They would move the people who they conquered to other parts of Italy, like the entire city, so that they would mix them up so that they wouldn't be able to rebel and could make like a one centralized government easier. And they started colonies all over the place all the time. So You know, like when Julius Caesar took over France, they killed. France had like 5 million people, and they killed like 1 million. They killed like a fifth of the people, and then they brought a bunch of Italians up. You know, and then they basically annexed the whole language. You know, the French spoke Latin, and then after, you know, the fall of Rome, modern day France, modern day Portuguese, Italian, and Spanish are all pretty much the same language, especially Italian, Portuguese, and Spanish. So, um, yeah, so you know they took over all of it. So it's easy to imagine how a language would just die. Everybody would just start speaking Italian or Latin. So, um, yeah, so I mean, good job for keeping that parchment for that long, is what I would say. You know, instead of like, oh my God, why is this so different? It's different because it's a different language. And so people should take it from there, and you know, maybe try to recreate the Etruscan language. Maybe you could recreate the Etruscan language just from that one book by being super creative and just picking out words, you know. But anyway, this is just the idea, the video that I did about it, listening to the Wikipedia article once, like 2 weeks ago when I first got the request. I couldn't do this again because my internet sucks so bad. So, and I couldn't upload videos, and so I didn't have the motivation to do it. So, but now I did it. So if this uploads fast, I'll be more motivated to do longer videos and request videos and stuff. But this is an interesting one. Okay, peace out.